So in moving from one aspect of the water world to another aspect of the water world, and one of our chief administrators of our water world is Craig Cotten. Craig comes to us here in the San Luis Valley in our Division 3. He is the division engineer for the Rio Grande Basin. He's also the Colorado engineer advisor to the Rio Grande and Costilla Creek compacts. So it's very essential, especially as we look in those compact agreements between Colorado and New Mexico and Texas and actually the country of Mexico as well. Craig has been admitted as an expert and has testified as an expert witness in many Division 3 water cases and trials and hearings. He's a graduate of Colorado State University, my alma mater as well. I didn't tell you about that hat that I wear or that role that I have in my background, but Craig and I are both very proud of our Colorado State University education. He comes out of a civil engineering background, has worked for the Division of Water Resources for over 28 years. And so Craig and his family, strong representatives here in the San Luis Valley. Craig, we're so wonderful that you are an advocate, one of our water experts, and an individual who's definitely helped us navigate through these paths of water issues. So Craig, welcome this morning to the symposium. We're great that you're here with us.
Thank you, Armando. I appreciate that. And welcome everybody. I understand that there's maybe up to 200 people at this symposium, so that's great. It's good to see that interest in water. And I'm going to go through and just talk a little bit about where we are right now, where we've been in the past, and where we are going to be in the near future in several aspects of our water. And so I'll go through this relatively quickly, but I know there's some other speakers that are coming after me that are going to put some meat on the bones and talk a little bit more about all of these issues. So let me see if I can share my screen here and get started. So I did want to just jump right into this, and like I said, I'll go through these fairly quickly, but I did want to talk about past issues here, and specifically surface water to get started. And so this is a graph of the Rio Grande near Del Norte, and long-term average back to 1890 when that the gauge was first put in, all the way up to present. And that dotted line there you can see is the long-term running average. And so right now we're about 640,000 acre feet of long-term running average over that 130-year time period that we've had records for. And I want to specifically focus on the last 20 years or so. And that's the time period that we've experienced our long-term running drought, aridity here in the valley. And just to give you an idea of that, I'm just going to put a line on here, just an arbitrary line at about 750,000 acre feet, just to give you an idea. And you can see in most decades, we have quite a few years, at least two, sometimes up to 5 or 6 years in each of those decades that are above this 740,000 acre foot line, except the last 20 years, the last 2 decades. And you can see in the 2000s, we only had 1 year that was above that. And in the 2010s, we only had 1 year, and that was 2019. And so long-term period of below average flows, and very few years in that period where we've had extensively above average flows, and that just kind of dries out everything and causes us to have problems to get back to normal even when we do have a normal snowpack. And speaking of snowpacks, this is the latest snowpack graph from the state of Colorado, and you can see each of the basins, and you can see the upper Rio Grande Basin in the lower part of Colorado. We're at 93% right now, and we did have a fairly significant bump because of this last snowstorm. And fortunately, we're not the lowest in the state anymore. We were before this last snowstorm. We were in the low 80s, and now we're at 93%. The Arkansas and the Yamp and White basins are lower than we are right now, but we're still not up to that average amount. And if we take a little bit closer look around the valley, and these are the snowtail sites around the edge of the San Luis Valley. And these are what we use and what the NRCS uses to determine how much snow we have in each of these locations. And then really what we're interested in is the snow, what's called the snow water equivalent. And that's the amount of water in that snowpack and how that compares to an average year. And so you can see over on the San Juans, Wolf Creek Summit is 129%, Middle Creek 117. So they're really looking good. Lily Pond and Cumbres Trestle on the Caneos are in the 120%. So really look pretty good there. As we get and go clockwise here and go farther up into the northern part of the valley, Slumgullion's only 83%. Then you get around the Saguache area, 70 to 80%. Sergeant's Mesa is only 67. And then it just gets kind of worse and worse as we go around and we jump over to the Sangre de Cristos. Hayden Pass, 52%. Mandel Pass is the only one on the Sangres that's above 100%. But then if you get it down into Ute, Trinchera, and the Culebra Creek drainages, really gets a lot drier, and we can see that that they are really struggling with having a good snowpack so far. We'll still have some time, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But right now, some areas look good, other areas don't. One of the things I did want to point out on this is even these sites like Wolf Creek, Middle Creek, Lily Pond that are showing significantly above 100%, that's at the higher elevations. One of the problems that we have had in the past is we don't have a really good measurement at the mid and lower level elevations. And sometimes we can have pretty high numbers at the high elevations, but just not much snowpack at the lower elevations, and therefore that's going to cause us to not have a good runoff season too. So here's a graph of just where we are throughout the season, and this is the black line is this year, 2022. The green line there is the average over the last 30 years where we should be. And you can see we're 93%. We're almost up to that green line. Not looking too bad. But one of the things I want to point out, and I'll add in last year here. So the red line is last year. And last year we were at about 100% of this time of the year. And we actually jumped up to a fair amount above 100% at our peak at around April 1st is when we usually peak on our snowpack. So last year, our snowpack and our snow water equivalent actually was looking good and overall above 100%. But it turns out if you remember last year, the actual runoff and stream flow that we had in most of our stream systems was only about 70%. And the reason is we're just in a long-term drying situation. The soil moisture is not very good. And so a lot of this snowpack just goes into the ground and it actually doesn't run off and get into our stream systems. And so that's another thing that we need to take into account when we look at this. Looking fairly good, but we really need a lot more snow. This is just an idea of what the NRCS is calling for, and you can see in that box and go across what they are saying is going to be the runoff. You can see on the San Juan side, not too bad, 70, 80%. We've got a few 100% there on the Caneos. But if you go onto the Sangre de Cristo side, very low, mostly in the 30 and 40% range. And looking forward, here's the seasonal temperature outlook, and this is for February, March, and April from the National Weather Service. And you can see that the southern Colorado is definitely scheduled for higher temperatures over the next 3 months. And then if we jump to the precipitation outlook, we're going to be there, at least they're calling for below average February, March, and April. And then if we jump forward to April, May, and June time period, we're still in that below average area. And it's not until we get to the June, July, August time period, the middle of the summertime, that below average kind of moves off to the northwest, and we're in the equal chances. They're kind of they're looking at maybe having about an average precipitation for our June, July, and August time periods. So I want to and apologize for going through this fairly quickly, but I want to get a lot of things in here really quick before we have to move on. As most people know, we do have new groundwater rules and regulations that went into effect last year. They apply to almost all the non-exempt wells here in the valley, and there's two components of that. The well owners have to replace their injurious depletions, and they have to sustain the aquifers. And the way that most of the people will do that, the well owners will do that and meet those obligations, is through sub-districts. And I think the next panel is going to talk a little bit more in depth about sub-districts. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, there's 7 sub-districts right now currently operating. And each year, those sub-districts have to come up with their annual replacement plan, or their ARP. And this just tells the state engineer how they're going to meet those two obligations, how they're going to replace their depletions, and how they're going to sustain the aquifer. Last year, all 7 sub-districts presented ARPs to the state engineer, but only 6 of them were approved by the state engineer. And the one that was not approved was the Sawatch sub-district, because the state engineer and I didn't feel like the Sawatch sub-district had the ability to fully replace their depletions to Sawatch Creek. They were ultimately allowed, they appealed that decision and were ultimately allowed to pump last year, but they were shut off for a time. And so hopefully they'll be able to move forward and be able to pump this year too. And then sub-district number 1, I'm sure is our biggest sub-district, and one that a lot of people have heard of, kind of struggling with some sustainability issues, making sure that the aquifer is built back up to a sustainable level. And so that I'm sure is something else that the panel coming after me will discuss in more detail. Another way that well owners can meet the obligations of the rules is through an augmentation plan. And there are a couple of ways that a person can do an augmentation plan. One is called a 1-for-1 augmentation plan. Basically, if somebody has a ditch and a well, they can take their ditch water, put it into a recharge pit, basically put that ditch water into the ground, and then pump it back out through their well. And that's called a 1-for-1 augmentation plan. So in essence, they're not pumping groundwater, they're pumping surface water. And so they don't have to comply with all of the rules of pumping groundwater out. And it makes it a little bit easier to have that well operational. The other way is to have an augmentation plan using response functions. Response functions are kind of an outflow of the model that we use to figure out what's going on with our groundwater, and that's called the Rio Grande Decision Support System model. And so you can use a response function to develop those aug plans. Response functions are usually what the sub-districts use. A little more complicated, a little more moving parts than a 1-for-1 augmentation plan, but in a lot of cases it works well, and maybe even a little bit better in some instances. I did want to point out that we've had 3 recent what I call blanket augmentation plan filings in water court, and I use the term blanket augmentation plan filings because it's a larger area, kind of a blanket of an area for these augmentation plan filings, a larger number of wells involved in this. Excuse me. And in fact, our last one that was just filed in December includes about 17,000 acres. And so right now, most of the well owners are involved in sub-districts, but there are some well owners right now that are looking at these individual or blanket augmentation plans to cover their wells. A couple of other things that I just wanted to just briefly touch on. One is the Rio Grande Compact lawsuit, and I assume that some people have probably known about this for a while, and probably other people don't know anything at all about this. But this was a lawsuit that was filed by Texas, by the state of Texas, against New Mexico and Colorado, filed in 2013, and then, excuse me, the United States joined as a party shortly thereafter. So there's 4 parties, and it has to do with the Rio Grande Compact. Texas is claiming that there's a violation of the compact terms, mainly by New Mexico. And one of the things that Texas is concerned about is the pumping of groundwater that New Mexico is doing below Elfin Butte Reservoir, kind of in the southern part of New Mexico. And Texas is saying that pumping that groundwater is actually affecting the rivers, the Rio Grande going to Texas. And so they're claiming that New Mexico is kind of pumping the river out from under them and not allowing that water to get to Texas. Kind of an interesting situation, and really something kind of very similar to what we've got going on right now with groundwater rules and regulations, and requiring wells here in the valley to replace injurious depletions to the river so that we don't hurt ditches here in Colorado. But this is mainly a fight between Texas and New Mexico, this lawsuit. But it does have the possibility of impacting the state of Colorado and our water users if a wrong decision was made down there. And so Colorado is actively involved in that lawsuit, and we are an active party in making sure that Colorado water users are protected on that. So there was the first portion of the trial was held this past fall, and then the second part of that was supposed to be held this spring. That trial has been stayed for now because we are in mediation, and each of the states in the United States are meeting and trying to work out a way to solve this without actually going through with the whole trial. So stay tuned on that, and we'll have some more information for you hopefully next year, and we'll be able to say that we've got it all figured out. But it's a long-term process. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just briefly too is the abandonment process. And this again is something that some people know about and other people don't. But the statute gives direction to the state and division engineers that every 10 years, the state and division engineer should do an abandonment process. And this is on water rights. And so it's important to understand that in the state of Colorado, water is not owned by the water user. The water itself is owned by the state. The water user, a ditch user, or a well owner has a right to use that. It's kind of, I like to think about it as kind of a long-term, kind of a perpetual lease. As long as you meet certain criteria, you can use that water. But one of the criteria is that you actually do use that water. And if you decide to not use that water for an extended period of time, we consider that to be what's considered abandoned, and that water right will be taken from that person and given back to the system. So, and it really is a thing, and some people think about that as not a good process, but I really do think that it is a good process for people that actually have water rights that they are using. Because the problem is, if somebody has a water right that they haven't used for 40 or 50 years, and then all of a sudden they come in and start using it again, it could impact those people that have come to rely on that water and using that water over the last 40 or 50 years. So we do this decennial abandonment process every 10 years. And so we're in the middle of the 2020 abandonment process and going through that. Some of these are voluntary downgrades that people have wanted to do. Others are partial abandonments. Maybe they've only irrigated a portion of their field over the years, and so it'll just be a partial abandonment. But that process is in water court right now. If you do have any questions about that, if you've got a water right that's on that abandonment list, call our office, and we can give you more details about that. And I think that is my presentation. So I don't know, Armando, if we're taking questions or if we've got time, but I appreciate everybody's attention to this, and I appreciate everybody being here this morning.
Thank you very much, Craig. As you can always see, there's always something exciting happening in the water world, and it never stays stagnant. So like a flowing river, and how the water keeps moving through and keeps going on. So does our discussions, topics, and issues that we deal with water. Craig, I don't believe we do have any time for questions at this time. If people might put them in the chat, maybe we can get them to you in the future, and maybe we could post something up on our website that's focused with the symposium, and we may be able to get them at a later time. But thank you very much, Craig. You always offer us kind of what is that state of the basin. That is an essential reason why we're here for this conversation. And you always set us up with a good foundation to be able to continue our discussion, conversation, and dialogue going forward this morning. So thank you, Craig. Appreciate all the information. And I think compared to last year, I think we're looking a little bit better than at this time last year, aren't we?
We're actually about the same.
About the same.
But you never know. I'm always the optimist. We've still got a few months to go, so we could just get dumped on for the next 2 months and have a great year.
I love the optimism, Craig. They say that farmers and ranchers are the most optimistic people. They can have challenges that come to them, and they're always looking forward to next year. The two best years for a farmer are the year 20 years ago and next year. So we will keep that optimism as we move forward. And thank you for setting us up with that tone this morning. Appreciate it, Greg.